The great innovation in a way is epistemological. It's like how do we know things? What can we know with what certainty, kind of certainty? And he wanted to push away this whole elaborate and in important ways impressive edifice of scholastic, based on classical thought. What relationship does this have with the other things we associate with Descartes? We think of Descartes as a mathematician. We think of him as an inventor of analytic geometry. We've all done Cartesian coordinates. So how do we bring those things together? What does his method have to do with sort of the substantive things we associate with him?
First of all, at the time, Descartes and the other explorers, natural explorers, you were a generalist. You did everything. You studied salt crystals and snowflakes, and you did dissections, and you had, and as you say, epistemology was very important at this time because of what I was just saying. You needed a ground. People felt this general society-wide crisis of meaning. They needed a new foundation. And he tried to provide that, and then along with that was his division of reality into these two states, mind and body. And he did that partly because of this fear that he was undermining the church. And his notion was that by saying there are these, well, it's not a matter of saying it. It's a basic human reality that we live in two worlds all the time at the same time. The seemingly eternal realm of the mind, and at the same time we're chained to these bodies that decay and die. And this work that was being done by these natural philosophers was on the material world. And Descartes' idea was that by asserting that there's a hard split, a hard division between these two things, he was protecting the world of faith, or what he would have called mind-soul. Mind-soul was on one side of the equation, and the body and the planets and all of that stuff was on the other side. Now, even in his time, people, as soon as, by making that distinction, putting that wall there, people said, this is going to be a problem, because as science, which wasn't called science at the time, it was actually called Cartesianism, as science encompasses more and more, then the terrain of mind-soul becomes smaller and smaller until then people start to say, we don't need that, that's irrelevant, that's just a figment of our imagination.
Right. So this idea of mind-body dualism is one of the other big ideas that we take from Descartes. It's something that even now remains sort of an interesting controversy in philosophy and in the sciences. For Descartes, though, and then this gets us back to our detective story in a way, and to his fate there, lying on his deathbed in Stockholm. This had some practical significance that plays into your story. So to go back to this great figure lying on his deathbed, we have his passing very suddenly, unexpectedly, and we immediately have sort of this fight over his legacy more broadly, which you've just outlined neatly for us as being very scientific on the one hand, but having sort of a religious and theological impulse on the other, and quite literally a fight and dispute over his remains. Yeah. So how does that work? How does that story unfold?
He dies in Stockholm in 1650. In this sort of 15-20 year period before his death, he builds up this huge following of Cartesians who are spread across Europe. In the 16 years after his death, they proliferated, and they functioned kind of like the Christians in early Rome, Christians in the catacombs. They were a semi-persecuted cult. They were treated kind of like a cult. People didn't understand what this thing, Cartesianism, was. They knew it had a lot of potential, there were, it wasn't the case that these were people saying, this is science and it's going to supplant religion. It was, and this is sort of one of the themes throughout the book and throughout the modern centuries, is that this conflict and confusion over what's the terrain of science and what's the terrain of faith, that seems endlessly complex now, was the case then when it was sort of launched and has been ever since. These Cartesians are trying to win legitimacy for their cult. And there are people in power in both the church and the state who are interested in it and also feel threatened by it. They see it as a potential tool that they could use, but is it also going to undermine what they're doing? So they had to win legitimacy. And there were people that were highly placed Cartesians. And they then had an idea, and again, there were all these parallels with Jesus and his followers. They had an idea to use the body of their master. He had died in Stockholm, and they said, why don't we have him dug up and brought back to Paris? So the ambassador in Stockholm, a man named Terlon, was an interesting figure. He was a Knight of Malta. He was a Christian warrior. And he had a reverence, a religious reverence for these things, but also he was a man of the world, a man of science. He asked the Swedes to have them dug up and brought back. But then, before the remains were shipped off, he asked the Catholic Church permission to take a bone as a relic. And so he took the right index finger bone as a religious relic of Descartes, seemingly because for someone like him, for these kind of people at that moment in history, someone who was doing what Descartes was doing, who was trying to penetrate the mysteries of nature, was doing a spiritual activity. So, and there were people, in fact, after Descartes died, people had seances about him, and so, this was an odd period of time when people were doing sort of seances and scientific experiments as part of them, and so Terlon has the remains dug up, takes a finger. The head goes missing then too, but we can talk about that separately.
Right.
And then there's this little posse of Frenchmen who bring the rest of the remains back to Paris, and the Cartesians there are waiting, and they greet the remains, and they are paraded through the streets of Paris, mimicking the medieval parade of the remains of Saint Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. This medieval parade of relics, and they wind up at the Church of Saint Geneviève. And they are interred there, and then there are these banquets that they hold all over the city, to which they carefully invite important figures in church and in the state, all to win legitimacy for their cause. So that's sort of the first use of the bones.
Right, and so you're very good at drawing this out, but you like that parallelism, that somehow these advocates, these passionate Cartesians for modern science and for his new method, are in promoting their teacher adopting the techniques, in a sense, of the traditions they're trying to overthrow.
Yeah, I mean, everybody you have to use metaphors that you know,
right.
and the trappings that you know, and they
right.
over and over you see them using the church and its traditions in their cause.